Hey everyone, I'm Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle. You are listening to the September 11th, 2015 edition of the College Daily Slant, powered by Pro Football Focus and brought to you by DraftKings.com. This is the PFF radio show dedicated to college football and daily fantasy sports, and we have a great show coming up. With me is Wes Huber, a college football DFS savant and a PFF fantasy college football lead writer. You can follow him on Twitter at PFF_Wes. Wes, how's it going?
Doing great, Matt. I'm really excited to go over today's games.
Yes, it's great that we are past that first week of college football. There were some surprises. Some games definitely didn't go the way that people thought they would. If your week one fantasy lineups didn't go the way that you wanted, don't fret. You've still got a whole season of college football to get everything right from here. And a key to doing that could be checking out all the college football content at Pro Football Focus. If you don't subscribe to the site, you should get the PFF Fantasy Gold package for only $29.99. If week one got you tilted, PFF can help get you straightened out. For this week's show, we're going to start by looking at some notable storylines for Saturday's games. Wes is going to highlight some of the important Vegas lines, and then we're going to get into our week two DraftKings and FanDuel plays of the week. And Wes is even going to throw your way a couple of plays for Fantasy Feud. Stick around till the end. Wes, let's get into it. Give us the rundown of the top storylines, the happenings, events, injuries, suspensions, all of that. What are the news items of the week that you think fantasy players need to be aware of?
All right. Well, we'll go some pretty in depth here and look at some players that will cover in pretty much every format. Let's start out with quarterback. On the injury news, Reginald Bell Jr. of Eastern Michigan is a game time decision this week against Wyoming. He's a really good player, so that's definitely somebody that may impact a few team owners out there. I don't know if you saw the game last night with Western Kentucky and Louisiana Tech, but man, Leon Allen had a horrific knee injury last night, one of the worst I've ever seen, and he's definitely out for the year. They've not released the injury information, but he's definitely done. DeAndre Furby took over there at Western Kentucky, and he looks really good. A big bruising back, definitely put some punishment on the Louisiana Tech defense. Definitely a name to keep in mind. Notre Dame, there was a big injury there with Terrion Folston, running back. It's definitely going to create a race to the waiver wire to pick up C.J. Prosise. He's going to be a beast, and head coach Brian Kelly's already said that he's going to give him around 20-plus carries a game, and that's gold right there. And in Missouri, Russell Hansborough, he's looking like he's going to be a play this week against Arkansas State. I think you can feel pretty confident getting him in your lineups. Of course, we lost James Conner of Pittsburgh, and that's a huge loss. First-round pick there, and actually his backup was also lost last week. Unsure of how long he's going to be out, but Chris James is probably not going to play this week. Look for Quadri Olison to play, and that's a big name to keep in mind. Colorado State's Trace Gerald is going to be coming back from a knee scope this week against Minnesota, and he was a decent player last year, but we'll see what he does on the field. He's going to be his carries could be limited, his touches, and we just don't know yet. And then Hawaii is going to be playing at the Horseshoe this week. Ohio State, Stephen Lakalaka is going to be out. Paul Harris would rather start. Not sure how much value is going to be there. And then if you normally would start Devontae McFarland of Syracuse at running back, you want to keep an eye. He was a late scratch last week against Rhode Island, and he's questionable to play this week against Wake Forest. At wide receiver, Rashard Higgins, possibly the best wide receiver in the country. He had an undisclosed injury that was not released to the press, and right now he's looking like he's going to be a play. Of course, we lost Mike Williams last week to a fractured vertebrae when he ran into the goalpost, and pretty much those targets are probably going to be absorbed between Jermone Hopper, Ray McLeod, Deion Kane, and Sharon Peak. And then Purdue's Danny Anthrop is also out this week against Indiana State. It's not been made official, but he's having some problems with that repaired knee that he had off-season surgery on, which would give D'Angelo Yancey quite a bit of value against Indiana State. He had a great game last week against Marshall, and He was already somebody to keep an eye on. And then Georgia State, we talked about last week, lost Donovan Harden to a broken foot. Well, this past week, Avery Sweeting, he was also lost, and he'll be out this week against New Mexico State, and most likely longer. On the suspension front, Duke Williams, the Duke Williams watch, he's good to go. He's going to play against Jacksonville State, so keep him in your lineups. Kareem Hunt will serve the second game of his suspension, and Terry Swanson will get a second start of Toledo. And at wide receiver, of course, H-back, Jalen Marshall and Dontre Wilson, as well as Joey Bosa, will return from their one-game suspension. And big news out of Idaho today, Desmond Epps, the guy the wide receiver that put up, I believe, 15 receptions and had 20 targets. He is suspended for this week's game. I'm not going to go into the details of that suspension, but yeah, he will not play against USC. Ethan Carter, tight end, he for some reason was suspended for another week after serving his one-game suspension last week, so he won't be playing this week against South Alabama. On the starter front, Will Greer will look to start will be the first quarterback on the field for the Gators against East Carolina. Both he and Treon Harris were pretty good last week, but man, Will Greer looked good and definitely somebody to keep an eye on, and we'll talk more about him later. At running back, Justin Davis is looking like he's going to be coming back, but Trey Madden will retain the starting position against Idaho. It'll be an onslaught for the running backs, the USC running backs, and Ronald Jones Jr., who I pointed out last week would be somebody to watch, and he came through. He's gonna also be somebody to watch this week. And that's it on the news front.
All right, Wes, let's talk about some of the Las Vegas betting lines. For a lot of fantasy players, the over and the under and the spread are key pieces of information when making lineup decisions. Talk to us about any matchups with attractive Vegas lines, matchups with players that you think we should play. What games have a lot of point opportunities?
Okay. Well, we'll start out in Bowling Green at Maryland. It's a 71.5 over-under, which is obviously something you want to get some exposure to. And it's actually increased from 65.5 over the last 5 days. Maryland put up 479 yards last week against Richmond with 7.6 yards per rushing attempt. Both Brandon Ross and Wes Brown would look to be in play this week against Bowling Green's defense. Bowling Green did put up 557 yards against the stout Tennessee defense that many predicted would really come through this year, and that's yet to happen. Bowling Green attempted the highest number of deep targets at 15, completing 7, and Matt Johnson accounted for 249 of his 424 yards on those deep attempts, which is really impressive. And Maryland, they allow 201 rushing yards a game and 236 passing yards a game. The rushing yards are definitely something to keep an eye on there with the Bowling Green backs, and Bowling Green, to top that off, allowed 207 rushing yards and 292.4 passing yards, which are both at the bottom of the NCAA from last season. So this is definitely a game to get your hands into. And the second game there, I like Washington State at Rutgers. It's a 63 over-under, and that's pretty much remained constant over the past 5 days. Washington State put up 411 yards last week, and that stunning defeat at the hands of Portland State at home, no less. But I really think that I watched the game, and I think that the offense was just out of sync. They weren't putting the drives together. They were yet to find their rhythm. But I've been reading reports out of practice, and it sounds like Luke Falk has really been clicking the past few days. And the coach is really confident that he's going to have a great game. And I really think that they'll actually pull the upset there at Rutgers. Now, that doesn't mean the Rutgers team's off limits there. Chris Laviano and Leonte Carew are definitely going to be in play there. Rutgers actually generated 539 total yards and 16.5 passing yards per attempt last week against an FCS opponent, but nonetheless, that's very impressive for a Rutgers team that's really not been much of a passing offense. outside of Carew the past couple of years. Washington State only allowed 145.7 rushing yards last year, so that would really limit the Rutgers ground game, to an extent. So Paul James may not be the best play this week, but as far as the passing offense goes, it'll be great. But yeah, and that's where Washington really struggled, where they allowed the second most passing yards in the country at 296.6. Rutgers is they allowed a lot of rushing yards last year at 211.8. Washington State does not rush the ball. They look for they spread out their offense, and they passed, I believe, the second or third highest in the NCAA last year. And the third game we'll get to, I really like Oregon and Michigan State. It's a 64.5 over/under. It's actually dropped slightly over the past couple of days, but I'm not really that concerned with that little tidbit. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a game that you must watch if you're a college football fan. Oregon put up 731 yards last week in a revenge game for Vernon Adams against Eastern Washington, and he was really impressive before he was hit late by a defender who was actually suspended for a week. They averaged 8.5 yards rushing per game and 9.5 passing yards per attempt last week. Or I'm sorry, 8.5 rushing yards per attempt. And so they were definitely clicking on all cylinders. Michigan State, they really looked good. Actually, they came out on fire to start the game. They dropped down a couple notches on the intensity scale later in that game against Western Michigan and allowed them to make a slight comeback in the end. But Connor Cook still averaged 8.3 passing yards per attempt, and his vertical passing looked tremendous. I really think this is going to be just a backwards affair, and I'm back and forth affair, and something that you definitely want to get involved into. Now, the one thing to consider is that Michigan State, they only allowed 97.5 rushing yards per game last season, which was top 10, and and they completely shut down Jarvian Franklin of Western Michigan last week, held him to 18 yards before he left with a concussion, and only allowed 196 passing yards last season. So I'm interested to see what Vernon Adams is going to do against that stout Michigan State defense. Finally, the last game that I'm really looking to stack is Tulsa at New Mexico. If you played the Tulsa and Florida Atlantic at Tulsa game last week and had some exposure there, you definitely did well. It was definitely a hot game there. A lot of defensive players and offensive linemen had to leave the field for dehydration. There's a 75 point over/under there in that game, and it's jumped up 6 points in the past 5 days. Tulsa allowed the most rushing yards, actually the fourth most rushing yards in the FBS last week to FAU. 300 yards, 4.92 rushing yards per attempt, and 3 touchdowns. They also produced the 5th highest passing yardage at 424. Look for Kevin Lucas and Kieris Garrett to have big games there at Tulsa. New Mexico, they didn't get much of any resistance at all from Mississippi Valley State, which is to be expected. They finished the Delta Devils finished at 2-9 last year in the SWAC. It was just a confidence building game for New Mexico. And New Mexico, actually, if you look at the numbers, they were actually decent against the pass last year, but that was masked by the fact that they finished at the very bottom in the country at bottom 5 at rushing defense. So it doesn't matter though. Tulsa will be able to do whatever they want in that game, whether it be run or pass. And like I said about the weather, Tulsa will be playing in a second game with high 80s degree temperature and 40 plus humidity. It's going to be a hot one, and there's going to be a lot of defenders that will not be able to stay on the field, which will play right into the hands of the Tulsa offense. And New Mexico's rushing defense or rushing offense will also be in play.
All right, now Wes, talk about the matchups that you think people should avoid or people should have caution about based on the Vegas lines.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't really matchups that I would completely avoid. More that I'm not playing more than one player off the roster just to save myself from very, very low scores, especially DFS. I really don't like the matchup with Oregon State at Michigan. Well, of course, we have both Oregon teams playing two Michigan teams, but it's a 45.5 over under. It's actually dipped 3 points over the last 5 days. Oregon State, they only managed 391 yards last week against Weber State, and a very subpar 5.0 rushing and passing yards per attempt against an FBS opponent is not something that instills a lot of confidence in playing anybody on that team. Michigan was actually less impressive with 355 total yards, but they played a stout Utah defense that will give a lot of teams trouble this year. And Michigan only averaged 2.6 rushing yards per attempt. I do like Devion Smith in that game, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be stacking anybody. Oregon State allowed 158.2 rushing yards and 248.1 passing yards last year, but this is a completely different defense than what we saw last year with the new coaching staff. So I'm not really buying into any of those numbers. And the same with Michigan with Jim Harbaugh. He's gonna produce a good product, no doubt about that. But I don't know if he's going to be able to follow what they did last year exactly. But they did only allow Devontae Booker to have 69 yards on 22 carries. All right, and the second game that I'm staying away from is Wake Forest at Syracuse. All right, normally that would be a no-brainer. Both of those teams are at the bottom of their respective conferences. But after last week, they faced FCS opponents and really gave the impression that, maybe they're, going to be able to produce something this year. Now, no doubt there's going to be some individual performers on those teams that are going to come through and produce some decent numbers, but I'm going to stay away from this matchup for stacking purposes. It's a 40.5 over under, which is enough said right there. And it's actually dipped 5 points over the last 5 days. Wake Forest, their quarterback, John Wofford, looked tremendous last week. But again, he was against an FCS opponent, and I'm not buying into it. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, Devontae McFarland for Syracuse may not even play. And with them losing their starting quarterback and going down the depth chart, I mean, it's an obvious matchup to avoid. Finally, I'm going down to Idaho at USC. Now, again, it doesn't mean that I'm avoiding all players on USC. USC is actually a 44-point favorite, and they're going to score a lot of points. So there's going to be some plays there. But what it does mean is I'm definitely not playing anybody on Idaho, and I'm unlikely to have too much exposure on stacking on USC's roster. Cody Kessler is really highly priced in a lot of, for good reason, in a lot of formats, and he's probably one to avoid this week. I don't see the USC starters playing past the second half. Now, the running backs are going to be in play, and so are some of the wide receivers. I just don't think Cody Kessler is somebody you want to have a lot of exposure to, if at all. It's a 67-point over-under. It's risen by 1.5 over the past 5 days, and that's partially due to, like I said, Desmond Epps being suspended. And having him not on the team, it just means that Idaho is really going to struggle. Basically, play your Trojans and avoid the Vandals at all costs.
All right, Wes, fantastic information. All that's going to come in handy when people are setting their lineups this week for daily college fantasy football. And of course, the NFL regular season is also starting this week, and people should really look to start the season by winning $2 million in week 1 at DraftKings.com, America's favorite one-week fantasy football site. Of course, I'm talking about the Millionaire Maker. It's the biggest fantasy football contest ever. $10 million in prizes are up for grabs, including $2 million for first place and $1 million for second place. 1 week fantasy football means no season-long commitments. It's fantasy football on demand. Play where you want, when you want, with the players you want. Just pick your players, pile up the points, and pick up your cash. That's it. You've already been scouting players for your season-long fantasy team. Put all of that knowledge to the test this football season at DraftKings.com. Hurry to DraftKings.com now and use promo code PFF for a free shot at $2 million in the Week 1 Millionaire Maker. Enter PFF for a free entry now at DraftKings.com. That's DraftKings.com. All right, Wes, let's get into our week 2 plays for DraftKings and FanDuel. Who are your guys at the quarterback position?
All right. Well, I'm gonna start out with my my DraftKings pick, and it's Malik Zaire for Notre Dame. Comes in at $7,300, complete steal against Virginia. We saw what Josh Rosen did last week, the true freshman out of UCLA. I really think Zaire is going to have a Zaire. I'm not even sure how to pronounce his last name. He completely dismantled the Texas defense last week. It was very impressive, and really got to give a lot of props to head coach Brian Kelly for moving on from Everett Golson, because he definitely knew what he was doing there. Last week he completed 19 of 22 passes. We actually had 2 drops, would have been 21 out of 22 with 3 touchdowns. And what's even more impressive from his performance, with the 3 touchdowns, is he didn't even tap into his rushing potential, and that's something that we can count on moving forward. Complete embarrassment of the Texas Longhorns. He actually was 1 of 2 on 20+ yard targets. That is likely to increase as well this week against Virginia. And the one completion was a 96-yard bomb to Will Fuller, which was just added to his day. And just to give you an idea of how dominant he was, he completed 80% of his passes when he was under pressure. This is a guy that's put himself directly on the map as far as NFL potential. And there is just no way you can overlook him, fade him this week. On FanDuel, I really like one of the guys. If you read my stuff, Greg Ward Jr. He's one of my favorite players in all the country. One of the most underrated players in all the country. Comes in at $8,000. On FanDuel, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for my quarterback, since I can lower my overall salary from the tight end position. He's going up against Louisville. Louisville's a good defense playing at Louisville. The Cougars and new head coach Tom Herman. I mean, they're definitely led by one of the most dynamic players in the country. And he, besides the fact that he averaged 60 yards rushing per game last year, he posted a 76.0 accuracy percentage that finished as 11th best in the country. What's really amazing about Greg Ward Jr. is that he started the first 5 or 6 games as a starting wide receiver. And just decided, I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to quarterback and go ahead and complete 54.5% of my 20+ yard attempts, which was 4th best in the country. He was amazing last week against Tennessee Tech, which, FCS opponent, but you still have to be a gamer to put up the numbers that he put up. 21 of 27, 3 total touchdowns, 275 passing yards, and 101 rushing yards in less than 3/4 of action. I'm all in there.
Yeah, I like that. I'm actually going with 2 guys who are tangentially connected to Greg Ward in a way. My first is Lamar Jackson of Louisville. They are playing Houston. He's 6,100. I'm going cheap at the quarterback position. Jackson is a true freshman in his first college start. Louisville is a 13.5-point favorite at home and projected to score 34 points against a Houston squad with a defense that really struggled against Power 5 opponents last year. Last week in his first college game, Jackson rushed for 16. He rushed 16 times for 106 yards and a touchdown. He's a dual threat quarterback, and he had a tough matchup last week against Auburn and was able to get that production. Jackson has a high floor. I think he has a high ceiling for his price. And then best of all, he's only the 17th highest salary at his position. So if you go cheap there, then in theory you can stack up at other positions later. And then on FanDuel, I'm going with Cardell Jones at Ohio State. His offensive coordinator from last year is now the head coach at Houston. And in my my optimal lineup column this week for FanDuel, I was very tempted to go with Greg Ward Jr. I just couldn't really make it fit in a lineup. But going with Cardell Jones, 9,500. Ohio State is a 41-point favorite at home against Hawaii. They're projected to score around 52.5 points. Just passing up that point potential is something that's really hard to do. Jones is the most expensive quarterback in the slate, but I'm paying up for a guy who has great rushing production, which gives him a really high floor. And I think he has a fantastically high ceiling, too, on account of the matchup and his athletic teammates. His week 1 performance merited him a solid 1.8 grade at PFF. He's just a guy that if you are going to pay up for the quarterback position, you can feel pretty confident in getting a return with him. Let's go to the running back position. Let's do 2 guys each at DraftKings and FanDuel. Who are the 4 running backs you like this weekend?
All right, well, first thing I want to add is even though Louisville is the favorite to win that game, I'm going Houston. All right, at the running back position, I'm going to start out with the guy I'd already mentioned, Notre Dame's CJ Prosise. He's coming in at $5,200 at DraftKings. They're going up against Virginia, who are basically shredded by the trio of running backs at UCLA. Like I said before, Brian Kelly's already said he's going to give him 20-plus carries. That's more than enough for him to reach his quota against the Virginia defense. He saw 20 carries last week against a tough Texas run defense, managed 98 yards, and he has a lot of experience playing receiver previously in his career, and that will play nicely into the DraftKings PPR format. Another guy that stepped forward last week was Rodney Smith of Minnesota. He's going up against Colorado State, has a very low $4,700 salary on DraftKings. The Golden Gophers have been searching all offseason for a replacement for David Cobb, and they actually started the TCU game with Roderick Williams Jr. at featured in the backfield. By the end of the game, that player was Smith. He emerged with his decent approach to attacking the TCU defense, and of course the TCU defense was unsurprisingly stingy to Minnesota's run offense. But Smith managed to average 80 or to put up 88 rushing yards on 5.5 yards per rushing attempt and a touchdown. This week he'll go up against Colorado State. Now, Colorado State, they're going through a lot of changes, new head coach, new quarterback. Of course, they have Rashard Higgins, but their defense allowed Savannah State running back Richard Williams II to record 73 rushing yards and a touchdown. Rodney Smith is an easy choice for me in my lineups at that price. Over on FanDuel, and probably the result of having their first game canceled due to nearby lightning, Leonard Fournette of LSU comes in at $6,900. I know they're playing Mississippi State, and that's a tough opponent, but that just guarantees that we're going to be seeing a lot of Leonard Fournette. His size at 6'1", 230 pounds means that he's already proven he can handle the SEC punishment that they throw at him, and he has SEC speed at that size at 4.52 40-yard dash time. He gets the Lions share of team carries within Coach Cam Cameron's Air Coryell offense, and they have dynamic playmakers in Travin Durrell and Malachi Dupree at wide receiver. So that pretty much guarantees that the box is not going to be overloaded with linebackers. They have to play back slightly. Then if you look back at the last the end of the year last year, he was other than a week 2 or week 12 shutout against Arkansas, he was provided with 20-plus carries, either 20-plus carries, 140 yards, or he took a seat earlier against UK when they completely destroyed him. He's definitely somebody you want to get at that price. The other guy I like that I previously was not big on, actually, when I wrote my my preview series focusing on the AAC, I avoided this guy completely and didn't even mention him. But Jahad Thomas last week for Temple really impressed me. He comes in at $6,400. And, he really struggled last year as a sophomore. Was not impressive at all by the PFF standards. But he wasted little time last week against the number 1 rushing defense from 2014 in Penn State. And he had 30 touches, produced 3.93 yards after contact per touch, which was third best in the country last week, and produced a 91.7 elusive rating, which was the 8th best. I really think he may be a player that's going to emerge this year as a DFS option.
Great stuff. I like those picks. At DraftKings, I'm going with Derrick Henry, Alabama, $9,200. Alabama is projected to score 45.5 points against Middle Tennessee State, and they're supposed to win by about 35 points. Kenyon Drake is likely to see significant touches, but Henry, he's capable of doing immense damage on limited touches. Last week, he had an elite 181.3 elusive rating and a strong 2.3 grade from PFF. Per rushing attempt, he averaged more than 9 yards after contact, which is just an insane number. And this week he gets to face a defensive unit that last season struggled to stop teams from Conference USA. His ceiling, not just this week, but really almost every week, is the single week rushing record and 6 touchdowns. I mean, he has that type of potential. And his realistic floor is 100 scrimmage yards and a touchdown. I'm also going with Zach Langer at DraftKings out of Tulsa, $6,600. As we've mentioned before, he has a great matchup this week. He was one of the picks that I made last week, and I'm going back to the well. He's a matchup-dependent banger, but last week he really exploited a soft opponent to the tune of 25 touches for 123 scrimmage yards and 3 touchdowns. And this week his matchup might be even better. Tulsa's projected to score 35, around 36 points against New Mexico as a 3.5-point underdog on the road. As you mentioned, it has a 75-point over and under. That's the highest on the slate. Last year, New Mexico had one of the worst defenses in college football. They allowed 268 yards and 3.3 rushing touchdowns per game. Langer is a huge guy, 6 feet, 220 pounds. He is the type of guy who is going to score those rushing touchdowns for Tulsa. He's the slate's 9th most expensive running back, but he really has top 5 positional upside in that slate. At FanDuel, I'm going with Patrick Scove, or Scove. I'm going to say Scove at Georgia Tech, $5,900. Only 2 running backs in the slate scored more points last week than his 25.2 fantasy points. People don't like him because he's a graduate transfer from Stanford. He didn't really do much before coming to Georgia Tech. His production last week was against an FCS school, so it's a little suspect, unrepresentative. And then plus Georgia Tech runs an unconventional offense. But Scove, he's the starting B-back in Georgia Tech's offense. That team's projected to score around 41.5 points at home while beating Tulane by 28.5 points. Last week, he had 3 touchdowns on 12 carries. Last year, he had 4 touchdowns on 12 carries. He's 6'1", 235 pounds. He's just the type of guy who scores a lot of touchdowns. He's that big-bodied bruiser for that team. He will very likely get double-digit carries, and with that, he will probably get a touchdown. He's built to score touchdowns, and Tulane's defense is built to give up touchdowns. And then my last guy at FanDuel, Keith Marshall from Georgia, $5,200. As a freshman in 2012, and that was really the last season he wasn't injured, Marshall was good enough to force a timeshare with Todd Gurley, and on a per-touch basis, he actually outproduced Gurley. Marshall last week against Louisiana Monroe had 10 carries for 73 yards and 2 touchdowns. This week, Georgia is a 20.5-point favorite on the road against Vanderbilt. They're projected to score 35.5 points. I'm going cheap with Marshall here, thinking that he has a pretty decent chance of getting at least 50 scrimmage yards and a touchdown. At Georgia, they haven't been opposed in the past to going with 2 running backs if that second running back is a competent guy, and Marshall is more than competent. Okay, Wes, let's go to wide receivers. Who are the 4 guys that you like at the wide receiver position?
Yeah, I'd also add that you can add Sony Michel to the list of running backs for Georgia. He's going to be another guy to keep in mind. At wide receiver, I like Cortland Sutton out of SMU with $5,100. He was one of the top freshman performers from last week against a really tough Baylor secondary. He caught both of his 20-plus yard targets for all 77 of his receiving yards and took both of those to the house and averaged 3.15 yards per out run on 26 snaps en route. The other guy that I'm really excited about is Braxton Miller, and you already touched on Ohio State and Cardale Jones, and I really like Braxton Miller because not only is he showing some really soft hands as a wide receiver, but he's also going to take some carries out of the Wildcat and get some rushing yards there. He and Ezekiel Elliott were obviously the 2 most explosive weapons for Cardale Jones to use last week. Of course, Mike Thomas is another guy to add there. But this week should be no different against Hawaii. The only thing I'm afraid of is taking an early seat. But it's the home opener at the Horseshoe. I really think they're going to put up a really good offensive output there. And like you said, it's going to be a game where Ohio State's projected to score north of 50 points. And if you saw the spin move that Braxton Miller put on the Virginia Tech defense, I mean, that was just nasty. Just broke ankles all over the place. People didn't know what to do when he had the ball in his hands. The other guy I like is over on FanDuel is De'Runnya Wilson of Mississippi State. His salary is lower because of last week it went up against Southern Miss, and Southern Miss gave him all they could handle. It only served to keep his salary decent. This week they're going up against LSU. Last year against LSU, he put up 4 catches for 91 yards and a touchdown. I see similar production, possibly more. He's a behemoth target, a red zone target, somebody definitely for Dak Prescott to look for and likely to be needed against a good LSU team. And then finally on FanDuel, I like Aaron Burbridge of Michigan State at $6,800 going up against Oregon. That's going to be just a shootout. It's, like I said, it's probably the most anticipated matchup of the entire weekend, depending on your likes and dislikes. But you could definitely justify using several players off both teams in a stack, even in cash games. It's going to be that type of offensive barrage. And like I said earlier, Connor Cook looked amazing last week throwing the ball deep. He's definitely justified the reasoning behind his being placed in the Heisman race. The only downside that he showed was his completion percentage, but honestly, that looks a lot worse than it actually was. There were several drops and from what I could tell, some issues with the routes being run by the receivers. But overall, he looked great and fed Burbridge with a 3.42 yards per route run, which is exceptional. And the fact that he only put up 80 yards only and a touchdown last week was basically because they had the game in hand and really pulled back and ran the ball with several different running backs.
I like a lot of those picks. Now, I have a question for you. The wide receiver from Rutgers, how do you pronounce his name?
Leonte Carroo.
That's what I figured. I've heard it pronounced differently. I think I've mispronounced it before. I just wanted to make sure I got it right. I'm going with Leonte Carroo from Rutgers on DraftKings, $6,700. Last week, despite playing in only one half of football, Carroo had 3 receptions for 129 yards and 3 touchdowns. Last year, he caught an elite 45% of Rutgers receiving touchdowns. At 6'1" and 215 pounds, he had great physicality. This week, he's the 5th most expensive wide receiver, but he could be the slate's most productive receiver by the end of the weekend. Rutgers is a 2-point favorite at home, projected to score 32.5 points against Washington State in a shootout with a 63-point over-under. That's the second highest over-under on the slate. Carroo should see action all game against one of last season's most porous defense, really just an atrocious defense. His 2014 PFF receiving rating was 85.1. That was 10th in the nation entering 2015. Last year, he had 55 catchable targets, and he didn't drop one of them. If the ball is in his vicinity, he's a guy who's going to come down with it, and they put it in his vicinity a lot. So I expect big things from him. Another guy I'm going with at DraftKings is Stephen Mitchell Jr. from Southern California at $4,100. Wes, you had mentioned USC is a team maybe not to stack with, but that there could be potential deep plays at running back or wide receiver. For me, he is that deep play. This recommendation is based almost solely on the Las Vegas lines and the history of how quarterback Cody Kessler has distributed touchdowns to his receivers in high-scoring games. USC is a 43-point favorite at home against Idaho, projected to score almost 55 points. That's the highest point total in their slate. Last week, USC scored 55 points against Arkansas State. Kessler threw touchdown passes to 2 different wide receivers, including Mitchell. In 2014, in his 5 games in which USC scored at least 40 points, Kessler threw 3.8 touchdowns to 2.6 wide receivers per contest. So closer to 3 wide receivers than two wide receivers would catch touchdown passes whenever USC was just putting up a lot of points. So I think the odds are very high that this week there's at least one other wide receiver besides Juju Smith-Schuster who catches a touchdown pass. I'm going with Mitchell because last week he was tied for the team lead in receptions. And of all of the wide receivers who I think have a reasonable chance of catching a touchdown pass, he is the cheapest. and that's just kind of the way I like to go. If I'm just taking a dart, it's almost I just want to go cheap. At FanDuel, I'm going with Nelson Spruce of Colorado, $8,100. He's one of the top wide receivers in the country. And really last season, despite being on a 2-10 team, he averaged almost 9 receptions, exactly 100 scrimmage yards per game, and 1 touchdown per game. Last week, Spruce was merely adequate with 8 receptions for 69 yards. Like, for a down game, that's pretty good. But he still has the slate's second highest salary in his position, in part because Colorado is a 13-point favorite at home against Massachusetts. They're projected to score 37.75 points. UMass last year had one of the worst defenses in college. And in Colorado's 2 victories last year, and one of them was against UMass, Spruce averaged almost 12 receptions for 158.5 yards and 1.5 touchdowns receiving. Like, that's a smoking stat line. With Colorado's high projected point total, I think Spruce has the potential to approximate those numbers this Saturday. And then my last wide receiver on FanDuel is Alex Erickson from Wisconsin, $6,200. Last week, Erickson had 6 receptions, 98 scrimmage yards, and 2 touchdowns against Alabama. In this slate, only Ohio State and Alabama are projected to outscore Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a 32.5-point favorite at home against Miami of Ohio from the MAC. Erickson is the undisputed lead receiver on a team that is projected to score 42.25 points, but he's only the slate's 12th most expensive wide receiver. So I think that's some really good discount value right there. Even if he is pulled early because of a large lead, I think he still has the opportunity to catch around 5 passes for 75 yards and a touchdown. I think he has a pretty high floor, even if he doesn't have a super high ceiling. All right, at FanDuel, who is your tight end play of the week?
And just to touch on what you pick, I love your picks there. They were great picks. At tight end, I really like, and of course we're just talking FanDuel here. Really like Austin Hooper, Stanford, $3,300, really underpriced for the talent level. Going up against UCF, who really struggled last week against Florida International. It really says a lot about the turnover that UCF had at wide receiver. They're just not the same team that we saw last year, and I think Stanford's going to be definitely someone to keep in mind there. Last year on passing plays, Hooper was only used as a blocker on 11% of his snaps while lined up at inline or in the slot. He's basically a guy they look in the receiving game quite often. He posted 40 receptions last year. Now, he did have 5 drop passes and lost 2 fumbles, but you have to consider that he was recruited to Stanford as a defensive end. There's going to be some mental lapses and some growing pains along the way, but he's absolutely one of the best tight ends in the country. He'll definitely be playing on Sundays one day. He caught 40% of his receptions on hitch routes last year, and actually had several of those last week against Northwestern, and posted a 155.8 wide receiver rating on catching 7 out of 9 post routes, which is impressive. Overall, he put up a 1.81 yards per route run, which is really good for a tight end. It's not Clive Walford levels, but it's definitely something that is very impressive, especially with Kevin Hogan at quarterback. And he caught all 5 of his catchable 20-plus yard targets with a touchdown, and was targeted at 20-plus yards with a healthy 14.3 target percentage.
All right, I like that. For me at FanDuel, my tight end is Hunter Henry, $2,800. I went with him last week. I'm going with him again this week. Last week, he was going against Texas El Paso for $2,800, the same price. He had 2 receptions for 42 yards, which is pretty decent, but he didn't have a touchdown, despite the fact that his quarterback, Brandon Allen, threw 4 touchdowns. This week, Arkansas is a 21-point favorite at home against Toledo, projected to score 38 points. The odds are high that Allen once again has a multiple touchdown performance. It's just a question of whether Henry gets one of those touchdowns. I think at some point he has to get a touchdown catch. Last year, he was the number 2 receiver in that offense in terms of receptions and receiving yards. And more importantly, I'm not really crazy about some of the other tight ends in his slate. So he's the guy I'm going with. I'm going cheap and on a team that's going to get a lot of points. All right, Wes, let's go to the flex at DraftKings. Who do you like this week?
All right, well, very similar to you and Hunter Henry, I'm going back to the well with Christian McCaffrey. I'm probably not going to play them both in the same lineup, Austin Hooper and Christian McCaffrey, just because of the the projected points for the game. But I can see myself having exposure in several different lineups for both of these guys. He's coming in at $5,300 at DraftKings. He's going to put up some points that are going to fit well with the DraftKings format, the PPR format that I already mentioned. Last week he had 6 targets. I see that going up this week. He actually had a fumble, a very uncharacteristic fumble that he was benched for a little while last week, or at least he just didn't come back into the game after that fumble for a while. I don't see him fumbling again. He'll have a bigger day, and I'm confident he can do well. The UFC defense was just picked apart by the Florida International offense, like I'd already mentioned, and they were actually really vulnerable to running backs coming out of the backfield. Last week, Alex Gardner put up, I believe, upwards of 80 yards receiving last week on him. So I think Christian McCaffrey is definitely someone to have some exposure to.
All right, for me at DraftKings for flex, I'm going with Terrell Newby from Nebraska at $4,800, pretty cheap. Last week, Newby led Nebraska in all rushing categories with 10 carries for 43 yards and a touchdown. He did that in a tough loss to Brigham Young at home. This week, he has more favorable circumstances. I think that will facilitate more touches and more yards per touch. Nebraska is a 27.5-point favorite at home against South Alabama. They're projected to score 40.75 points. Newby has the potential to accumulate over 100 scrimmage yards and to score multiple touchdowns. That's a lot of upside for a guy with only the 17th most expensive running back salary. I think even if other running backs come into the game, they get more carries than they ordinarily would. I think there will still be enough production with that high projected point total to go around for everybody. I think Newby will get his. Okay, Wes, it is time for Wes's winners. Give me some guys that you think will be big for GPPs.
All right, going back to Houston, which I've already made known that I'm a big fan of this year. I really like Kenneth Farrow against Louisville. Last week they didn't really need him. They played against Tennessee Tech, and like I said, Greg Ward Jr. just put on a clinic. He basically just sat in the backseat and let the team destroy the FCS opponent. Also last week, Louisville played Auburn, and the running backs for Auburn, even after they lost their starter Rock Thomas, they were breaking through into the second level just constantly. The Louisville run defense did not impress me, so it's really got me confident in Kenneth Farrell this week. Last season, he had 59 missed tackles, put up 2.99 yards after contact per attempt, and posted the 11th best elusive rating in the FBS at 85.4. I'm all over Kenneth Farrow at only $4,900 at DraftKings, and it's really a no-brainer for me. Another guy that I was not big on, along with Jahad Thomas prior to the season, was De'Veon Smith of Michigan. Now he was decent last week against Utah, but honestly, we all realized that the debut of Jim Harbaugh didn't go as he had planned. But his decision to put Smith at running back and start him was definitely the right move. He last week he was given 18 touches, and he was able to break 11 tackles on those 18 touches. He produced the 22nd highest yards after contact per attempt at 1.88, and he put up 115.0 elusive rating, which was the 5th best last week in the country. And he comes in at $4,900 on DraftKings, and that's a really good price, and definitely a GPP play there. Two other guys I like over on FanDuel. I really like Steven Anderson at $4,900. He didn't have the greatest game last week, but it was against an FCS opponent this week. They're going against San Diego State. I look for the Bear Raid offense to be in high gear, and definitely somebody to keep in mind. And then another guy that actually I've got some inside information considering where I'm located. Garrett Johnson at Kentucky. He had 80 yards and a touchdown last week, and as far as Mark Stoops' opinion, he is considered the team's #1 wide receiver. He comes in at $5,800, and last week put up 3.58 yards per route run, and he was one out of one on 20-plus yard targets where he caught his touchdown.
All right, Wes, and finally, we teased it at the beginning of the show. Give me your 2 plays of the week for Fantasy Feud.
All right, well, last week on my DraftKings cash game bankroll builder, I went with Dontez Ford. It wasn't the right move. I regret the decision. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody any money, but this week we get Tyler Boyd back going up against Akron, and he somehow is priced at $117,900. Now that seems high. We're talking about a top 3 wide receiver in the country going up against an average defense, and I'm fairly certain that Tyler Boyd is going to want to come out and put up some extremely impressive numbers after having to sit out last week. And then finally, the other guy, and I had mentioned earlier, was Will Greer of Florida. He was sitting on the bench at the start of the game last week. He's actually going to be the starter this week against East Carolina. He came in, made his debut performance in college football, and simply went 16 out of 18 with 1 drop passing, and then also took a 38-yard scramble for a touchdown. If you go back and look at the numbers he put up in high school, we're talking about an all-world athlete here, and I really don't think it's much of an argument, or you can't make a case to me that Treon Harris at 5'11", despite very, very dynamic athletic ability, should be starting at quarterback when you have a guy like Will Greer. Honestly, I'd move Treon Harris to H-back or hand him a clipboard and give him a spot on the sideline. Will Greer would be my starter, and there'd be no doubts about it until I was proven wrong. I really like him on Fantasy Feud at 92,200. I'm really hoping that he doesn't give up as many snaps to Treon Harris this week, but if he does, I'm still confident that he'll be able to put up enough numbers to justify that salary.
Wes, fantastic stuff. It's exciting to be into week 2 of the college football season. We're really starting to get into a groove. We hope that you are too, and we hope that joining us on the College Daily Slant can become a part of your weekly routine as you prepare to dominate your DFS competition. Be sure to tune in next week for our DraftKings and FanDuel Week 3 plays. Of course, you can catch us on PFF Radio. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, listen to the show on Stitcher and Blog Talk Radio, and watch the show on YouTube and the Fantasy Sports Network. For Wes Huber on Twitter at PFF_Wes, I'm Matt Friedman at Matt F. The Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.